Many Canadians are feeling anxious about the drastically changing world around them. Democracy, the discovery. The corridors of Windsor Castle hold secrets that have remained undisturbed for generations. Stone walls that have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the celebrations and sorrows of centuries, keep their silence with practiced discipline. But on a cold morning in late October 2024, that silence was broken. A team of royal archivists led by Margaret Thornhill, a woman who had spent 32 years in service to the crown, received an unusual request. The king himself had authorized an inventory of a private vault located beneath the oldest wing of the castle. This was not merely unusual, it was unprecedented. Private royal vaults are sealed spaces, repositories of personal effects and documents that pass from monarch to monarch. Their contents known only to the sovereign, they are not opened for inventory, they are not discussed. They simply exist like the crown itself beyond the reach of ordinary protocol. Thornhill received the sealed orders at 7:00 that morning. She read them twice, her hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what she held. The king's personal secretary had delivered them by hand, his face carrying that peculiar expression royal staff develop when handling matters of extreme sensitivity. A face that says everything and nothing at once. The vault in question had not been opened since 1952. 72 years of accumulated silence. The last person to enter had been the young Princess Elizabeth before she became queen, before she carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders for 7 decades. What she placed inside, what she chose to preserve or hide, remained her secret until her death in September 2022. The team assembled at 9:00, 6 people, each vetted and sworn to absolute confidentiality. They descended a stone staircase that few living souls knew existed, a passage that wound beneath the castle's foundation like a thread through history. The air grew colder with each step. Ancient stones pressed close on either side, worn smooth by centuries of careful feet. Emergency lighting had been installed the previous night, but the bulbs seemed weak against the gathering darkness, as though the shadows themselves resisted illumination. The vault door was extraordinary, solid iron, 8 in thick, installed during the reign of King George V. Its locking mechanism was a masterpiece of pre-war engineering, requiring 3 separate keys held by 3 different offices of state. The process of opening it took 47 minutes. Each tumbler falling into place echoed through the passage like a heartbeat. When the door finally swung open, the air that escaped was stale and impossibly cold, as though winter itself had been trapped inside. Thornhill entered first, her torch beam cutting through darkness that felt almost solid. The vault was larger than expected, roughly 20 ft square, with walls lined in weathered oak paneling. But it was not the size that made her breath catch. It was what the vault contained. Document boxes lined 3 walls stacked from floor to ceiling in meticulous order. Each box bore a date range written in careful script spanning from 1897 to 2022, over a century of secrets preserved and sealed. But these were expected in a sense. Royal households maintain extensive archives. What was not expected, what made Thornhill's pulse quicken, sat in the center of the vault on a table of dark mahogany. A leather journal bound in burgundy, its cover worn smooth by handling. Beside it, a wooden box carved with the royal cipher, and beyond these, a stack of letters tied with black ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. These items were arranged with deliberate care, placed precisely where they would be seen immediately upon entering. This was not storage, this was a presentation. Someone had wanted these things found, but only when the time was right. Thornhill approached the table slowly, her team remaining by the door as protocol demanded. She photographed each item from multiple angles before touching anything. The journal drew her attention first. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of old leather and older secrets. The first page bore an inscription in familiar handwriting, the distinctive script she had seen on thousands of official documents over her career. But this was different, this was personal. The words read simply, "For my son, when the burden becomes his own. May he understand what duty truly costs. Elizabeth R. Double quote. The room seemed to contract around those words. This was not an archive. This was a message across time, from one monarch to another, from mother to son. The Queen had known, had always known, that one day Charles would stand where she had stood and would carry what she had carried, and she had left him something, a gift or a warning, perhaps both. Thornhill's hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the crushing awareness of what she held. This was not meant for archivists or historians. This was meant for the king. She carefully closed the journal and stepped back from the table. Whatever secrets these items contained, they were not hers to discover. The inventory took 3 hours, but the team touched nothing on that central table. They cataloged the document boxes, noted their condition, and made their records. But the journal, the carved box, and the letters remained undisturbed, photographed but unread, acknowledged but not revealed. By early afternoon, the vault was sealed once more, its silence restored. The report reached the king that evening. He read it alone in his private study at Clarence House, the room lit only by a desk lamp against the gathering November darkness. Staff reported that he sat motionless for nearly 20 minutes after finishing the document, staring at the photographs included in the appendix, the image of his mother's handwriting, those final words she had left for him. Then he stood, straightened his shoulders with that particular gesture he had learned over decades of public life, and gave the order that would change everything. He would go to the vault himself alone. The king descends. The arrangements were made with the quiet efficiency that characterizes all royal operations. No press releases, no official acknowledgement, simply a blocked section in the king's schedule, 2 hours marked as private time, a designation that in royal parliament means precisely what it says. Questions are neither asked nor answered. The King's Range Rover departed Clarence House at 6:00 in the morning, when London Street still belonged to delivery trucks and early shift workers. Windsor Castle loomed against the pre-dawn sky, its towers and battlements catching the first hints of approaching sunrise. The castle at this hour exists in a state between night and day, between history and present, a liminal space where centuries collapse into a single eternal moment. Security had been notified, but only at the highest level. The staff who would normally prepare rooms and corridors for royal presence were absent. This was not a state visit. This was something else entirely. Charles entered through a private entrance known only to senior royals. A door set into thick stone that required a key carried on his person at all times. The passage beyond was narrow, unchanged since the castle's medieval origins, and he walked it alone. His footsteps echoed against stone worn smooth by the tread of his ancestors. Every king and queen since William the Conqueror had walked these hidden ways, moving through the castle's secret geography on errands of state, or matters too private for public spaces. The descent to the vault level required traversing 3 separate staircases, each one older and narrower than the last. The king had requested that the emergency lighting be left on, but he carried a torch regardless, its beam illuminating stone and shadow in equal measure. There is something about descending into the earth, into spaces where daylight never reaches, that strips away the trappings of office and rank. Down here in the cold and darkness, he was not a king. He was simply a man seeking answers his mother had left behind. The vault door stood open, held by the same 3 keys that had unsealed it days before. But beyond the threshold, Charles hesitated. He had opened hundreds of doors in his life, thousands perhaps. Doors to Parliament, to state dinners, to audiences and investments. He had walked through doors that changed history, that marked the transition of power, the beginning of reigns. But this door was different. Beyond it lay something his mother had specifically preserved for him, had kept secret through her entire reign, a reign that spanned 7 decades through wars and peace, triumph and scandal, joy and profound loss. He entered slowly, his torch beam sweeping the vault's interior. The document boxes lining the walls seemed to press inward, centuries of accumulated secrets closing around him. But his attention fixed immediately on the central table, on those 3 items arranged with such deliberate care, the journal, the box, the letters. He approached them as one might approach a grave with respect and a certain dread. The journal first, he picked it up, felt its weight, and ran his fingers over the embossed royal cipher on its cover. His mother's hands had held this, had written in it, had closed it and placed it here, knowing he would one day stand exactly where he now stood. He opened to the first page, read again the inscription meant for his eyes alone, and felt something break inside his chest, not his heart precisely, but some long-held tension, some barrier he had maintained between who he was and what he had become. The entries began in 1952, dated February 7th, the day after King George VI died, the day Elizabeth's life, as she had known it, ended, and her existence as queen began. Her handwriting was young then, less controlled than it would become, the letters flowing with an almost desperate speed. Charles read the first entry standing, then slowly sank into the chair someone had thoughtfully placed before the table. Today I became something I never wanted to be. His mother had written, "The crown they will place upon my head weighs nothing, but the weight of what it represents will crush me if I let it. I am 25 years old, and I will never again be only Elizabeth. That person died with Papa. What remains must be enough for a nation, for a commonwealth, for history itself. But God help me, I am so very afraid." Charles read on page after page of his mother's private thoughts, her fears and doubts, her questions about duty and sacrifice. She wrote about the loneliness of the role, about standing in rooms filled with people and feeling utterly alone because no one could truly understand what she carried. She wrote about watching her children grow distant, about the necessary walls between crown and family. She wrote about nights when she wept in private, then woke and put on the mask of sovereignty once more. These were not the words of the queen he had known, the composed and distant figure who had dominated his entire life. These were the words of a young woman thrust into impossible circumstances, trying to find solid ground in a role that offered none. And in reading them, Charles began to understand something he had never quite grasped before. His mother had not been cold or distant by choice. She had been protecting him and his siblings from the truth of what wearing the crown actually meant. She had kept this darkness to herself, had carried it alone, so they would not have to share the burden until their time came. The later entries grew more controlled, the handwriting steadier, but the core of fear never quite disappeared. It simply went deeper, became more refined, transformed from raw terror into a sort of grim acceptance. She wrote about moments of crisis, about decisions that kept her awake, about the terrible isolation of ultimate responsibility. And she wrote about her children, about Charles specifically, with a tenderness he had rarely felt from her in life. "I see in him the same sensitivity I once possessed," she wrote in an entry from 1981, "the same desire to fix things, to make the world better. The crown will beat that out of him, or it will break him entirely. I pray he is stronger than I was, that he finds a way to remain human while fulfilling the role. But I fear for him. God, how I fear what this will do to my son, the box, and the letters." Charles set the journal aside carefully. His vision blurred by tears he did not bother to wipe away. There was no one here to see, no cameras or courtiers, no performance required. In this stone chamber buried beneath Windsor Castle, he could simply be a son reading his mother's words, feeling the full weight of her love and her terror on his behalf. The wooden box drew his attention next. It was perhaps 8 in square, carved from dark walnut, its surface worn smooth by handling. The royal cipher adorned its lid, but this was an older version, the cipher of King George V. This box predated his mother's reign, had passed to her from her father, perhaps from his father before him. The clasp was simple, unpretentious, a small brass hook that lifted easily. Inside, wrapped in layers of silk that had once been white but now showed the yellow of age, lay a crown. Not the great crown of state, not the imperial state crown with its diamonds and history. This was something simpler, more intimate, a circlet of gold, unadorned except for a single inscription on its interior surface. Charles lifted it carefully, the metal cold against his palms, and turned it toward his torch to read the words etched into the gold to remind us of what we sacrifice. George V. 1917. The year George V changed the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, erasing centuries of Germanic heritage in response to anti-German sentiment during the Great War. The year he chose nation over family, public perception over personal history. Charles understood immediately why this crown existed, why it had been preserved. It was not a ceremonial object. It was a memorial to everything the role demanded you surrender. Identity, heritage, personal desire, everything bent to the needs of the crown, the institution that consumed the people who wore it. He set the circlet down gently and noticed something else in the box, tucked beneath where the crown had rested. A folded piece of paper, newer than the silk, the creases sharp and deliberate. He unfolded it slowly and found his mother's handwriting once more. Dated September 1st, 2022, 7 days before her death. "My dearest Charles," it read, "if you are reading this, then the burden has passed to you as it passed to me, as it will one day pass to William. I leave you this journal, so you will know you are not alone in your fears. I leave you this crown, so you will remember that sacrifice is the price of service. And I leave you the letters because you must understand the full cost of what our family has paid for this throne. I am sorry I could not be warmer, could not show you the love I felt every day of your life. The role does not permit such things, or I was too weak to find a way around its restrictions. Perhaps both truths exist together, but know this: every difficult moment, every time I chose duty over personal desire, I was trying to teach you what you would need to survive this burden. I was trying to make you strong enough to carry what I could not bear to see destroy you. The letters are your decision to read or burn. They contain truths that might better remain hidden, but I cannot make that choice for you. Whatever you decide, know that I love you. Have always loved you, though I showed it poorly. May God grant you strength for what comes next. Your loving mother, Elizabeth Charles, sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside this vault above in the castle proper, staff were beginning their morning duties. The castle was waking to another day of tours and ceremony of history, made palatable for public consumption. But down here in this buried chamber, time had stopped. He existed in a moment of pure suspension, balanced between the man he had been and the king he was becoming. The letters lay before him, tied with that black ribbon, their edges soft with age. He counted them quickly. 17 in total, their envelopes bearing dates that spanned from 1936, 6 decades of correspondence, preserved and hidden. The earliest envelope bore his grandfather's handwriting, addressed to my dearest Elizabeth. The latest was his mother's script, addressed simply to the heir. He untied the ribbon slowly, the silk sliding through his fingers with a whisper that seemed impossibly loud in the vault's silence. The first letter from King George VI to his daughter, dated December 1936, just weeks after his unexpected ascension following his brother's abdication. Charles removed it from its envelope with the care one might use handling butterfly wings. My darling Libet, it began, using the family nickname few outside the immediate circle ever knew. I am writing this in the early hours, unable to sleep, afraid of what tomorrow brings. Your uncle has thrown away the throne for love, and they call him brave. They do not call him selfish, though that is what he is. He has passed this burden to me, a man never trained nor prepared for such a role. I stammer, I doubt, I fear. I will fail utterly, but I will carry this weight because I must, because there is no choice. You are young now, too young to understand, but one day this weight will be yours. I am so very sorry. The letter continued raw and honest in ways no public statement could ever be, detailing the king's terror at his new responsibilities, his anger at his brother, his determination to, somehow, survive the role into which he had been thrust. Charles felt a strange kinship with this grandfather he had never known, this reluctant king who carried his burden with such visible struggle. He read through more letters, each one revealing another layer of the crown's cost. His grandfather wrote of the strain of leading a nation through war, of watching young men die while knowing his decisions contributed to their deaths. His mother wrote of the loneliness after her father's early death, of the impossibility of grieving publicly while remaining the symbol of stability. There were letters between his parents, his father's words revealing depths of frustration and emasculation Charles had never fully appreciated. The Duke of Edinburgh, always 2 steps behind, always secondary, his considerable abilities subordinated to the needs of the crown. And then Charles found the letter addressed to him, dated 1997, written in the aftermath of Diana's death. His mother's handwriting steady despite what she must have felt. Charles, you must never read these words while I live. But after I am gone, you must understand. Diana's death was not your fault, though I know you believe it is. The crown demands sacrifices, and we are all scarred by what it takes from us. Your marriage ended not because you failed, but because the role makes authentic human connection nearly impossible. I failed with your father in the same way. Father in the chose duty over love so many times that love itself withered. We are all casualties of this institution we serve. You tried to bridge both worlds to be human and royal simultaneously. That effort nearly destroyed you, and for that I am profoundly sorry. I should have warned you, should have prepared you better. But how do you teach someone that to wear the crown, you must hollow yourself out and fill the empty space with service? How do you tell your child that the price of the throne is every authentic feeling, every spontaneous joy, every moment of unguarded truth? Forgive yourself, my son, and if you can forgive me, the weight of truth. The torch beam trembled in Charles's hand, casting dancing shadows across the vault stone walls. He sat surrounded by centuries of secrets, by the accumulated grief and sacrifice of everyone who had worn the crown before him. The cold had seeped into his bones, but he barely noticed. All sensation had contracted to the letters in his hands, to the words his mother and grandfather had written, to the terrible honesty they had preserved but hidden. He read the remaining letters slowly, methodically, each one adding another weight to his understanding. There were 9 more spanning his mother's reign, documenting moments of private despair behind the public facade of perfect sovereignty. She wrote about the annus horribilis of 1992, when his own marriage publicly crumbled alongside those of his siblings. She wrote about the week after Diana's death, when public grief threatened the monarchy itself, when she had to choose between maternal instinct and institutional preservation. She wrote about the loneliness of Windsor Castle during the pandemic, isolated with Philip as he declined, unable to show weakness even in private because staff were always watching, always reporting, always maintaining the machine. I have worn a mask for so long. One letter read, dated June 2021 after Philip's death, that I sometimes forget what my actual face looks like. I am 95 years old, and I cannot remember the last time I spoke a completely honest sentence to anyone except Philip. And now he is gone. Charles will hate this role, William will endure it, but both will lose pieces of themselves they cannot afford to surrender. And I have no way to protect them from that loss. The letters revealed something more than personal struggle. They documented a pattern, a cycle that repeated with each generation. The heir unprepared, thrust into the role, forced to sacrifice everything human for the sake of the institution. The monarch isolated, trapped between duty and desire, slowly crushed under the weight of impossible expectations, and always the knowledge that this burden would pass to the next generation, that the cycle would continue, that the crown demanded its price from every person who touched it. Charles set the last letter down and looked around the vault with new eyes. The document boxes lining the walls represented more than historical archives. They were the physical manifestation of secrets accumulated over a century, of truths too dangerous or painful to acknowledge publicly. How many other royal vaults existed, he wondered, scattered across palaces and estates? How many other hidden spaces contained similar revelations, journals, and letters that told the real story behind the pageantry and protocol? The carved crown sat beside him on the table, its simple gold surface reflecting his torch beam. He picked it up again, feeling its weight, thinking about what it represented. George V had created it as a reminder of sacrifice, but sacrifice for what exactly? For the good of the nation, the traditional answer would say, for stability and continuity, for the preservation of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. But reading these letters, seeing the human cost laid bare, Charles found himself questioning whether the price was justified. His mother had served for 70 years, had given her entire existence to the role, and what had it cost her? A lifetime of emotional suppression, of choosing duty over family, of watching her children struggle, and being unable to offer the comfort they needed because the role forbade such human weakness. His grandfather had killed himself with stress and cigarettes, dying at 56 because the crown had demanded more than his body could give. His great-uncle had abdicated rather than face a lifetime of such service, and history had judged him a coward, though perhaps he had been the bravest of them all. Charles stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold and the long stillness. He walked to the nearest wall of document boxes and ran his fingers along their edges, reading dates that stretched back to Queen Victoria's reign, 1897 to 2022, 125 years of monarchy, of service and sacrifice, of public triumph masking private despair, and now it was his turn. Now he would add his own secrets to this vault, his own letters for William to discover one day, his own attempt to explain the inexplicable. He returned to the table and carefully gathered the letters, retying the black ribbon with hands that had steadied, as understanding settled over him. The journal he closed gently, running his palm across its worn cover one final time. The crown he wrapped again in its silk and placed back in the box. These items would remain here in this vault, waiting for William, just as they had waited for him. The cycle would continue because it had to, because centuries of tradition and constitutional necessity allowed for no other option. But something had changed in the reading. Charles felt it like a shift in the air pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. His mother had left these items not just as an explanation, but as permission. Permission to acknowledge the cost, to admit the struggle, to understand that wearing the mask did not mean he had to pretend the mask was his true face. She had spent 70 years maintaining perfect composure, but in death she had given him something she could not give herself, the truth. He thought about his own reign, barely 2 years old, and the mistakes he had already made, the public speeches that felt wooden and distant, the attempts to modernize that pleased no one, constant awareness that he could never simply be Charles Windsor, that the role consumed everything else. But perhaps, he thought, armed with the knowledge his mother had left him, he could find a middle path. Not the complete submission she had practiced, nor the rebellion his great-uncle had chosen, but something in between, a way to serve while remaining human, to carry the burden while acknowledging its weight. The vault suddenly felt less like a tomb and more like a bridge, connecting past to present to future. Every person who had worn the crown had struggled, had suffered, had questioned whether the sacrifice was worthwhile. But they had all in their way found reasons to continue. Duty, yes, but perhaps something more. The awareness that someone had to stand in that symbolic space, had to embody continuity and stability in a chaotic world, and that running from the role would only pass the burden to someone else less prepared. Charles picked up his torch and took one last look around the vault. The cold stones, the rows of document boxes, the table with its carefully arranged legacy. This space would remain, would preserve his mother's words and his grandfather's fears, would wait in silence for the next king to descend and discover what had been left for him. The cycle would continue, but perhaps with each generation, the understanding would deepen, the isolation would lessen slightly, the cost would be acknowledged even if it could not be avoided. He walked to the vault door and paused at the threshold, looking back into the darkness. Then he spoke aloud, his voice echoing off stone walls, addressing the ghosts of everyone who had stood where he now stood. I understand now. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. The vault made no answer, but then none was needed. Charles stepped through the doorway and began the long ascent back to daylight, back to the world where he was king, back to the role that would consume the rest of his life. But he climbed with something he had not possessed before, not certainty, but but understanding, not peace. And perhaps he thought that would be enough. The silence after the stone staircase seemed longer ascending than it had descended, as though the weight Charles now carried made each step more difficult. Behind him, the vault door stood open, waiting for the archivist to return and reseal it, to turn the 3 keys and restore the silence for another generation. But the silence had been broken. The secrets were known, and knowing changed everything. He emerged into a corridor that felt shockingly warm after the vault's chill. Though the November morning was hardly pleasant, early sunlight filtered through narrow windows, casting elongated rectangles of pale gold across flagstone floors worn smooth by centuries of royal feet. A security officer waited at the corridor's end, discreet and distant, acknowledging the king's presence with a slight nod, but asking no questions. This was the talent of experienced royal staff, the ability to see without seeing, to know without knowing, to maintain the machinery of monarchy while preserving its mysteries. Charles walked past without speaking, his mind still half submerged in the vault's revelations. The castle around him felt different now, less like a home or even a workplace, and more like what it truly was, a monument to an institution that consumed everyone who served it. The paintings on the walls, the suits of armor standing, eternal guard, the thick carpets, muffling footsteps, all of it was part of the performance, the grand theater of monarchy that required real people to play roles written centuries ago. He found himself in the king's drawing room, a space that had witnessed countless private moments of royal history. The fire had been lit, the room prepared for his return, though he had given no order for such preparations. Someone somewhere had anticipated his needs, had ensured his comfort, had maintained the invisible support structure that kept the monarchy functioning. He sat in a chair near the fire and stared into the flames, seeing not warmth but the faces of those who had come before him. His mother, young and terrified, wrote in that journal about fears she could never voice publicly. His grandfather, stammering through speeches, dying too young from the stress of unwanted responsibility. His great-grandfather creating that simple golden crown as a memorial to everything he had sacrificed. And beyond them, stretching back through centuries, an endless line of men and women who had worn the mask, carried the burden, paid the price. The weight of it should have been crushing. Perhaps it was crushing, but Charles found himself thinking not of the weight, but of the hands that had carried it before him. He was not alone in this struggle. He had never been alone. Every monarch had felt this same isolation, this same sense of being trapped between duty and humanity. And every monarch had found a way to continue, not because they were superhuman, but because they understood that someone had to stand in that symbolic space and had to be the continuity in a world of constant change. His private secretary appeared in the doorway, a question in his posture, but not on his lips. Charles nodded, permission to enter, to intrude on the private moment. The secretary approached with the day's briefing folder, appointments and obligations arranged in precise order. A speech to Parliament, a meeting with the Prime Minister, an investiture ceremony, a charity dinner, the endless machinery of monarchy grinding forward, consuming hours and days and years with practiced efficiency. Your Majesty, the secretary began, then paused, reading something in Charles's expression. Is everything quite all right? It was an unusual question, a breach of protocol in its way. Staff did not inquire about the monarch's well-being unless circumstances demanded it. But perhaps the secretary saw something in the king's face, some evidence of the vault's revelations, some crack in the usually impeccable facade. Charles considered the question carefully before answering. I have been reading my mother's private papers, he said finally. She left me some things, some truths about what this role truly demands. The secretary nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Her Majesty was very wise, he said quietly, and very brave. She was alone, Charles replied, and heard the edge in his own voice. She carried all of it alone because she believed that was what the role required. I am not certain she was right. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous in their honesty. This was not how kings spoke to their staff, not how the institution maintained its protective distance. But Charles found he no longer cared about maintaining that distance, not entirely. The letters had shown him the cost of perfect isolation, and he would not pay that price if alternatives existed. Your Majesty, the secretary said carefully, may I speak plainly? Charles gestured assent, curious where this breach of protocol would lead. I have served 3 monarchs, the secretary continued. Your grandmother, your mother, and now you. Each one carried the burden differently. Your grandmother had the war to unite the nation behind her. Your mother had time, 7 decades to perfect the role. You have neither advantage, but you have something they lacked. You have seen the cost before assuming the role. You know what it takes, what it demands. Perhaps that knowledge is its own form of strength. Charles considered this, watching flames consume logs in the fireplace. Or perhaps it is simply another form of burden, he said, to know the cost and choose it anyway. Is there any choice? The secretary asked, and Charles recognized the question for what it was, not rhetorical, but genuine, a question that had been asked in private by every monarch and heir since the role was created. There is always a choice, Charles said slowly. Edward made his choice, my mother made hers. I will make mine, but understanding the cost does not make it lighter to bear. They sat in silence. For a moment, king and servant, 2 men caught in roles neither had fully chosen, maintaining an institution that predated them both and would continue long after they were gone. Then Charles straightened his shoulders, a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious, and opened the briefing folder. The day's obligations awaited. The machine required feeding over the following weeks. Charles returned to the vault twice more, not to read the letters again, but to sit in that cold silence and think about what monarchy meant in the modern world. The letters had shown him the human cost, but they had also revealed something else, a pattern of service that transcended individual suffering. Each monarch had struggled, but each had also contributed something to the nation they served: stability in chaos, continuity through change, a symbol that united when politics divided. He began to speak more openly about the challenges of the role, carefully, but honestly, in ways his mother never had, not complaints but acknowledgments, the loneliness of ultimate responsibility, the difficulty of balancing tradition with necessary change, the personal sacrifices required by public service. Some criticized this honesty as weakness, as lacking the dignity of his mother's perfect composure. But others, particularly younger people who had never felt a connection to monarchy, began to see him differently, as a human rather than simply ceremonial, as someone struggling with real challenges rather than gliding effortlessly through a life of privilege. The vault remained sealed, its secrets preserved, but Charles had made one change. He had begun his own journal, writing with the same honesty his mother had shown, documenting the struggles and doubts, moments of despair and the small victories. One day, William would descend those stairs, would open that vault, and would find not just his grandmother's letters, but his father's words as well. Another generation's attempt to explain the inexplicable, to pass along hard-won understanding, to say what could not be said in public. The cost of the crown was real and terrible, but it was not meaningless. That was what Charles had learned in the vault beneath Windsor Castle, the sacrifice his mother had made, the struggles his grandfather had endured, the fears that had haunted every Monarch, these were not wastes but investments in something larger than individual happiness. An institution that had guided a nation through centuries of change that had been thread binding together. A commonwealth of peoples that had represented continuity when everything else seemed transient. Whether that investment was worth while remained an open question, one each monarch had to answer for themselves, but Charles had made his choice. He would carry the burden his mother had left him, would wear the mask when necessary, and would sacrifice what the role demanded. But he would do it with eyes open, acknowledging the cost, understanding what he surrendered, and perhaps in that honesty, he would find a way to serve without being entirely consumed by service. The vault would wait in darkness, preserving its secrets, ready for the next king. But Charles had emerged from that darkness with something his mother had given him, something more valuable than crowns or kingdoms. Truth, and in the end, perhaps truth was the only thing that made the burden bearable. What lies in that vault beneath Windsor Castle terrifies, not because of what it reveals about monarchy, but because of what it confirms about the human cost of service. Every crown leaves scars, every throne demands sacrifice, and every king must choose whether the burden is worth bearing. For Charles, choice has been made, the silence has been broken, and the truth, terrible as it is, has set him free. Share your thoughts about this in the comments. For more royal stories, like, share, and subscribe to this channel.